Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I am honored to welcome you to this event with Rita Colwell, presenting her new book, A Lab of One's Own, One Woman's Personal Journey Through Sexism in Science, with a special introduction from Harvard's own Melissa Franklin. Tonight's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science-related literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. Coming up in the series on September 18th, we will host Amherst professor Edward Melillo for a discussion of his latest book, The Butterfly Effect: Insects and the Making of the Modern World. To learn more about this and our other upcoming virtual events, you can sign up for the bookstore's email newsletter at harvard.com or check out the page harvard.com/science for more info. We also have a Science Research Public Lecture Series YouTube page where you can see previous talks that you might have missed. This evening's event is going to conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask Dr. Colwell something, please go to the Q&A chat at the bottom of the screen where you can submit your question. We're going to get through as many as time allows for this evening. Also, once the event begins, I will post a link in the chat to purchase tonight's featured book, A Lab of One's Own. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so a huge thank you for your support. Your purchases and your financial contributions, there will also be a donate link in the chat, make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever, support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you to all of you for tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and especially for science, because it really, really matters. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings the last few weeks, technical issues can arise. If they do, we're going to do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and your understanding. So now I am excited to turn things over to my partner in the Harvard Science Book Talk series, a renowned experimental particle physicist, and very fitting for tonight's lecture, the first woman tenured in the Harvard Physics Department. Melissa Franklin, the digital podium is all yours.
Good evening. I'm delighted to introduce my fellow scientist, Dr. Rita Colwell, who's written a frankly riveting book, A Lab of One's Own, with the nod of the head to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, that slim feminist volume. There's a moment in this book, a wonderful moment in this book, where Dr. Colwell gets that lab of her own, expands a lab, and you can see at that moment the magic really begins to happen. I hope I didn't give away too much. So I am part of the next generation of women scientists from Dr. Colwell and her colleagues, and they have done much to promote the cause of including women in science, which I have benefited from without even knowing what they were doing. And so reading this book is just seeing exactly what happened and how, and that's very interesting. So there's many women scientists, especially in the biological sciences, that have tried to make the scientific world a more welcoming and supportive place for us all, including me. And we sort of realized by reading this book that without these women scientists acting, it's not clear where we would be right now. The stories in this book are about scientific discovery, and they're lovely, lovely stories. I mean, we all love to read about scientific discoveries, and these stories, some very personal and some about her colleagues, are wonderful. Let's just say I love this book, and I wish I had known about Dr. Colwell's work earlier. Of course, I recognize Dr. Colwell from her 8 years as director of the National Science Foundation. So she's a very familiar face to me, but I have not ever read about her research, even though she has a transfixing story. So my introduction seems perhaps not as charming at all. Her book is really a story of her life and work. And this introduction won't be half as good as hers. Nevertheless, I'll just go on and start. Rita Colwell grew up near here in Beverly, Massachusetts. And I'm told that's on the Atlantic Ocean. And she was a first generation student who studied at Purdue University. And she received a bachelor's degree in bacteriology. And then with a little interesting hitches along the way, she got a PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle, again on the water, where she wrote a PhD in aquatic microbiology. Then she, of course, did a stint in Canada, which makes everybody a very wonderful person, and at the National Research Council in Ottawa, and finally arriving in Georgetown University as an assistant professor. Her studies eventually brought her to study something related to what an agent for cholera, and to bring together fields as disparate as evolution, ecology, physiology, marine microbes. And she somehow, in all of this, she cemented the connection between the environment and human health. So this is like a large journey. And the one thing she was always studying was Vibrio, which is a word I didn't know before. So I was very excited by this. The other thing I love about this book is that it tells about her journey, and it shows that she was so interesting. She was using computers even before they were actually, you know, when you had computers like that we have now. She was punching cards at the University of Washington, UW, to do her work. And she has continued to be sort of computational biologist now. In fact, she's now a professor at the Institute for Advanced Computer Studies at the University of Maryland. She left Georgetown to go to University of Maryland, where she was for many, many years doing her work. And she is a member of 5 national academies, including the one in this country. She has the National Medal of Science. She has many, many, many honorary degrees, but the prize I like best is the Stockholm Water Prize. I think she got a number of water prizes, but I love the idea that there's a prize for people who work on water, or in this case, walk on water. She has had numerous presidential level posts in scientific associations. So she's a master administrator. And she is still working, and she is still a professor at University of Maryland and also at Johns Hopkins University. So please welcome Professor Rita Colwell.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for a very, very kind introduction. I thought that it would be probably interesting to the audience if I commented a little bit about how I came to write the book, because this is the first book that is not really a strictly scientific treatise or lab manual or something about some particular scientific subject. It's really about just not my life, but also many other women who went through science and struggled despite setbacks of various kinds. So I started out about 5 or 6 years ago thinking it was probably a good time to write about cholera. I'd been studying cholera, well, really since my graduate student days, although I didn't know it at the time. I was studying Vibrios, and Vibrio cholerae is the causative agent of cholera. So I thought it would be a good idea to kind of tell this story. Fortunately, I got a phone call from a person who was to be my co-author, from Sharon Birch McGrain. She had called and said she would like to write a story about, or a book about, my cholera work. Well, that seemed very, very fortuitous. And so we began the collaboration. Now, in writing about cholera, the book rather devolved into the story of women in science, because my own trajectory from undergraduate all the way through to my current work now really is almost a kind of strange path through many different venues and many different patterns. It wasn't a direct, that I knew exactly what I wanted to do from the time that I was born. I wish it were that simple. It wasn't. In fact, when I was in high school, I decided I did want to be a scientist or a physician, but I was told quite bluntly by the science teacher that girls don't do science, think of something else. And my chemistry teacher actually refused to write a letter of recommendation to university. I did apply to several colleges, including Radcliffe, and I was accepted. But if I had gone to Radcliffe, I would have had to commute. The scholarship was limited and wouldn't have covered room and board and so forth. And my sister, an artist, had taken a position at Purdue, an interim position to teach art, but she had met a very handsome Dutch physicist whom she married. So she was at Purdue and suggested, why not apply to Purdue, which I did, and received a complete scholarship that covered everything: room, board, books, tuition, and I immediately chose to go to Purdue. Of course, my history professor, who was a Harvard graduate, could not understand why I would turn down an Ivy League, especially Harvard, to go to a Midwestern engineering school. But I have to say, I've never regretted it. I've learned so much during my stay at Purdue, and even more to the point, I started out, of course, in chemistry, thinking that would be something I would do, probably out of stubbornness, since my chemistry teacher said girls couldn't do chemistry. He's probably right, because there were so few women professors of chemistry in the United States at the time that chemistry was not, and still remains, a bit of a challenge for women in science. But in any case, I started out in chemistry, but the classes were huge. There were 200, 300 students, and if you were late to class, you would sit in the back and you could barely see the blackboard. Never mind even the professor in the huge auditorium. But I discovered bacteriology. There was a wonderful woman professor at Purdue. She was a rarity, probably one of the few full professors at that time. This is in the 50s, teaching as a full professor in a major university. She was an amazing teacher, and I immediately became fascinated by the subject of bacteriology and bacteria. And with the encouragement of my then roommate, Marilyn Miller, who eventually became a pediatric ophthalmologist and went on to medical school and continued her career. She convinced me that perhaps I ought to think about science and perhaps even consider medicine. So I applied to medical school, was accepted at the 3 that I applied to. But what happened in my senior year in March, just a few months before graduation, I went out on a date with a very handsome 6'2" graduate student who was just finishing his first year. Well, it was love at first sight. We were married 2 months later. And so in order for Jack Colwell, my husband of 62 very happy years, for him to finish, it meant that I probably should stay on at Purdue, at least do a master's, while he would then do a master's, and we'd go on together, I to medical school and he to graduate school to finish his PhD. He was accepted at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I applied to the medical school and was accepted. But then I got a second letter saying, oops, in order to be accepted to medical school, you have to be a legal resident of the state of Washington or of the Pacific Northwest, that is Vancouver, British Columbia, or Idaho, or Oregon. Of course, I wasn't any of that. So I for the interim, I thought, well, I will do graduate work and then move into medical school at the University of Washington. Well, as it turned out, I ended up doing my PhD, ending up in marine microbiology, a brand new field just being started by my professor, John Liston, who had arrived from Scotland just that year to start this new program in marine microbiology. Now, it sounds odd that we would be starting a new program when today marine microbiology is practically au courant. Everyone who does microbiology is interested in or knows something about marine microorganisms. But at that time, it was a totally open area of study. So working with John Liston, I studied the bacteria that were associated with marine animals and ended up becoming an expert on marine vibrios. These are very common microorganisms that are associated with marine animals, with the marine environment. They're salt-requiring bacteria. And one of the things that I did at the University of Washington was study so many of these isolates that I had gotten from the environment and studying so many characteristics for each one of them. In other words, I studied about 100 different characteristics: ability to ferment carbohydrates, to utilize proteins, to do a variety of interesting enzymatic capabilities, that in order to handle the data, I decided to use what was then a brand new computer at the University of Washington, located in the attic of the chemistry building. It was the IBM 650. It was a marvelous machine. Of course, today we realize it has the computational capacity of about a microwave, I suppose. But at the time, it handled my data rather well. And interestingly, you had to program it yourself. There weren't any programmers, and there weren't any courses in programming either. Fortunately, in my husband's lab in the chemistry department at the University of Washington, there was a chap, George Constabaris, who had come in from industry to do a postdoc with George Halsey, professor of chemistry at the University of Washington, with whom my husband was working as well. And George Constabaris took me under his wing, and he taught me how to program the IBM 650 to analyze my computer data for my microorganisms. So in essence, I wrote the first computer program in 1960 at the University of Washington to analyze microorganisms. Of course, at that time, we were just analyzing phenotype, that is, their ability to ferment carbohydrates or to utilize proteins, etc. And it was coded, and then we calculated similarities and developed a primitive evolutionary matrix. Of course, nowadays it's highly elegant, and we work with high-speed computers, and we're able to do some extraordinary kinds of analyses of the evolution of microorganisms, well, of life in general, using computers. But that was my start back in the 60s at the University of Washington, starting this new field of marine microbiology. I went on to the National Research Council because there had been a Canadian visiting scientist who had worked with George Halsey, and he had talked my husband into applying to the NRC in Ottawa to do physics. I applied because, of course, I was going to accompany my husband to do microbiology. And we both were accepted and received fellowships, letters announcing that we were awarded National Research Council of Ottawa fellowships. However, I got a second letter. My letter said, oops, because of nepotism rules, we're not allowed to have husbands and wives both holding fellowships. Of course, now you can, but this was in the 60s. So very upset, I went to talk to John Liston, and he said, well, why don't we just apply for a grant? Which we did. We applied to the National Science Foundation, and bless him, he made me a co-PI as a fresh new graduate student, graduating student, that is. So I was a co-PI on a National Science Foundation grant. He talked the chairman of the dean of the school into appointing me as a research assistant professor, and then granting me leave of absence. So I was off to Canada with my husband, who had an NRC fellowship. And of course, Dr. Gibbons, with whom I did my work in Ottawa, had offered me free access to his stockroom. I could rate it, and he had provided space for me to do my work. So I arrived at the National Research Council as a visiting assistant professor from the University of Washington with my own NSF grant. I think this is where I must say that despite the difficulties of being a woman scientist, it really helps to have a wonderful mentor like Dr. John Liston of the University of Washington, who paved the way for me to have a start in the field of science. And arriving at the NRC, being able to work there for a couple of years, Jack and I, he on his postdoc with Jim Morrison in low temperature physics, and I working with the group in applied biology with Norm Gibbons working on halophiles, we were able to publish a lot of papers, do a lot of work. And then we moved on. Jack received an appointment to the National Bureau of Standards in Washington, D.C., now known, of course, as the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So I applied for a position in Washington and was fortunate enough to be able to land a job teaching at Georgetown University with Dr. George Chapman, who had just been appointed chairman of a new graduate department of biology in a newly constructed building on the Georgetown campus. Of course, now that building is being torn down, but this was again in the 60s. So we moved into a new facility on the Georgetown campus where I carried out my research. By this time, I had become pretty well known for the work on Vibrios. And so it was very fortunate to be in Georgetown University near the Chesapeake Bay, because the Chesapeake Bay then became my laboratory. And amongst various discoveries that I made was the fact that Vibrios were very common in the estuarine environment of the Chesapeake Bay, just as they were in the harbors around Washington, around Seattle. And so at this point, I had become really, I suppose, an expert, you might say, or at least well-trained in Vibrios, this special group of organisms. Now, the type species, the reference strain, is Vibrio cholerae. That's a bacterium that causes Asiatic cholera. And when I gave a talk at the George Washington University to the local American Society of Microbiology, sitting in the audience was Dr. John Feely from the NIH. And he said, Dr. Colwell, why don't you study the cholera Vibrios? And my reaction was, well, I don't have a laboratory to handle pathogens. And his response was, well, unless you plan to drink the culture, it's perfectly safe to use in a BSL-2 or BSL-3 facility. And BSL-2 was a lab that I had at the time. That is, I could use microorganisms that were not respiratory agents, but simple enteric pathogens such as Vibrio cholerae. So that is how I got started on working with cholera. John Feely sent me about a dozen cultures. They arrived in the mail. I put them in the refrigerator. It was pretty busy, and that's how we stored cultures. And a week later, I got around to making the medium to grow these cultures, and I took them out of the fridge, and I transferred them to the agar plates, and they wouldn't grow. 2 or 3 days, 4 or 5 days, they didn't grow. I called John, I said, John, I don't think those cultures survived transport. He said, you put them in the refrigerator. Well, I said, yes, that's where you store cultures. He said, but not Vibrios. Vibrios, like bananas, don't belong in the refrigerator. Well, that was my first clue. This was interesting. Don't belong in the refrigerator? That's curious. But that was the beginning of my discovering that Vibrios go into a dormant stage, which is very difficult to coax them out of. And in fact, the only way I succeeded was by animal transport, that is by injection into gut of animals, or in the case eventually of a study we did at the University of Maryland, where these viable but non-culturable vibrios that were in the dormant stage were given to volunteers in a special study being done on cholera. And we were able to demonstrate that these bacteria would revive in the human gut and become, again, infectious. Of course, we had used attenuated Vibrio cholerae without the pathogenic properties, so that the individuals who were volunteers would shed the live bacteria but would not be ill from the disease. So that was one of several discoveries that we made over the years. And I ended up doing most of my work in Bangladesh. I was invited to go to Bangladesh because of the work I had done. And there I essentially fell in love with the country. I have worked in Bangladesh every year since. I now am on the board of trustees of North-South University, a new private university, and I've helped them develop a genomic sequencing facility. And I'm very proud to say that we've published 3 papers already from that laboratory, that new laboratory in Bangladesh at North-South University, where they now have Illumina sequencer and they're able to do DNA sequencing. So the work that I did carried me through the genomic revolution, the studies that I had done, that I had learned in studying genetics at Purdue, staying on to do a master's with my husband while he finished his master's in physical chemistry. I studied genetics. That was the founding of the work that I was able to do in molecular genetics, and then eventually be able to study the molecular biology, the genomics, the sequencing of Vibrio cholerae, and of the disease itself. So in a very, very short time, I've covered about 45 or 50 years of study. And it's probably a good idea, I think at this point, to take some questions, because I really have covered only a little bit of the book, and some of you certainly will have questions, I think, about the traverse through science as a woman, and maybe perhaps about the time that I ran the anthrax committee during the post 9/11 anthrax episode. That's a chapter in the book that I'm very proud of. It was a wonderful team, and we worked as a classified committee solving or tracing the origin of the anthrax that was used in that bioterrorist event. There are other stories in the book, which I hope you'll find interesting. And so now I'll turn it over to the questions.
Wonderful. So we have a question from Heather, who asks, what has been the response of men to your book? Do you think they've been enlightened in a way that will make them more able to consider the validity of female viewpoints going forward?
I think there are wonderful men out there who are very enlightened. I was very fortunate to have one such man as a father, my father. He was interested in education for everybody, girls and boys. I was lucky in my husband, who was a tremendously supportive companion and colleague and friend. And of course, John Liston, my thesis advisor, George Chapman, the chairman at Georgetown, and my colleagues at the University of Maryland. And I must say that those men who do care will probably find the book interesting and helpful. I can't say that every man will, but that's not to be expected, I think.
There's a question from Laurel, who asks, What advice do you have for women starting careers in science today? And she is a graduate student in physics.
I think she should stick with it. And despite all the setbacks and the slurs and the whatever you encounter, find a way over, around, or under it, or through it. But stay with it, because it's a wonderful career. If you're really interested in science, I cannot think of a better career at all. It's the joy of discovery is something very special, and the aha that comes with your hypothesis being shown to be accurate or correct, it's a pleasure that I think, bar none, that's the best.
The question from Sarah. Sarah asks, I run science and nature programs for young children, and we hold a mother-daughter science workshop every year. I'll recommend your wonderful book to all the mothers. Is there any advice you'd like to give the mothers or the daughters, or anything you would like to say to them?
Yes, the same advice that I use with my own daughters. One's a physician, and the other is a botanist at UC Davis. She's the curator of the herbarium there. They turned out to be scientists. And to my granddaughter, who is planning to be a neuroscientist, and that is take math, and by the way, take math, study math, and learn how to use computers. Don't be afraid of it. You're good at it. Girls are just as good at math as boys. Don't let anybody talk you out of it. Math is the Esperanto of science and engineering and technology, and be comfortable with it. And I would say learn how to use computers, not as something to keep your accounts or whatever, but as a scientific tool to use to figure out your equations or to figure out your hypotheses. Get comfortable with it, because that really is very important in the 21st century.
A question from Nicole. Let's see. How do we go from at least 50-50 men and women, if not more, in graduate school, medical school, and postdoc to 13% women CEOs in healthcare? So she writes, I'm still appalled by the amount of funding for women-led companies, which is less than 5%.
Right on. Very good question. Very good point. We do see that medical schools now are 52 to 54% women, perhaps even a bit more. We also see that girls are graduating at a higher rate than boys, which I think boys should graduate as well. That's not the point. But what happens when it comes time to become a full professor, when it comes time to become a dean? Fortunately, there are more women presidents of universities these days, but not enough to say that it's that common. It's still noteworthy when a woman becomes appointed president of a university. And certainly, I can tell you that having started a company, I found business to be far more sexist, far more difficult than university. The attitude is much more cutthroat and hardly gentlemanly. So there you need to have a strong back and a strong stomach to handle it. But again, stick with it. Women entrepreneurs do well. Ironically, women do well starting their own companies, which I find interesting. There are a number of women's startup companies. The irony of not having women on boards is really stark. It's been shown over and over again that companies make more money. They're more profitable if they have 3 or 4 women on their boards. Not just one token, but 3 or 4 women, because let's face it, at least half the population are the purchasers of whatever it is you're producing. So they're the folks who are buying your product, and understanding how to make products more attractive to more than And women are 52% of the population. We happen to be a bit more hardy than men. So when you have that proportion of the population as your clients, your customers, those to whom you sell your products, it makes sense to have them represented on your board.
You have so many good questions here. Nicole is a PhD student at Boston University, and she says, how has Professor Colwell dealt with comments that diminished her work because of being a woman? Did she have a comeback? Did she sidestep, ignore?
I just made it through. If rebuffed or if insulted or if told, don't bother your pretty little head, when I'd rather have had someone say, what a great idea you've got, I just persevered. I know that it's tempting to perhaps break down in tears and go off and hide in a corner. I just kind of got stubborn. And it just made me more determined that I would succeed and that I would find a way, that perhaps that particular path and that particular route might be blocked, but there would be another way and another route. And as I describe in my book, I started out going to medical school, met my husband, did a master's in genetics, which turned out to be very fortuitous. Went to the University of Washington expecting to go to medical school, studied microbiology, found out when I arrived that I had been recommended to work for a professor in the botany department. And when I was advised in the microbiology department by the advisor asking me about with whom I should work, I said, well, I should work with Dr. Roman, my professor suggested. And of course, the immediate response was a very stern, unhappy look on the face of the professor. And I thought, what have I done? And it turned out that that professor and Dr. Roman hated each other. So I immediately made enemies my first day arriving at the University of Washington. But I got through it, and I ended up working with John Liston, as I've just described, and that was positive. So all the way through things, you can make pretty good lemonade out of some lemons.
I love this question. How would you advise young faculty preparing to take or return from maternity leave?
I think what is very important to do is make sure that you're not saddled with all the dog's body work. That is the library committee, the lab safety committee, the introducing new students committee, every other committee under the sun, because you're the only woman in the department. Stand firm and select those that are really of interest and do one or two, but make sure that you don't become overburdened unfairly while the guys get on to do their research. And I think it is also important to have help. I really love the Nobel laureate who, the German Nobel laureate who used her Nobel Prize money to fund women to provide for housework and childcare. She gave fellowships, not for tuition, but to provide women with funds so that they could work, take care of children, and still do their studies. I think that's something that is really badly needed. And if I have a cause right now, it's for childcare, universal childcare. I think that is the biggest stumbling block for children and for women.
Let's see. We have a question from Harvey, Harvey asks, so we've talked about this a little bit, but this question is near to my heart too. So less than 20% of PhD physicists are women. What can be done to increase the percentage? And I actually, when I was an undergraduate, I also studied physics, but I was one of two girls in my 26-person class, and I was just miserable. And so I ended up dropping physics to study something else. So I would be interested to hear what your ideas for retention are. Yeah.
I think what's really important is that girls, women have to find a posse.
Yeah.
What do I mean by that? You have to find kindred spirits, and they're out there. And it can be another woman faculty member, it can be fellow students, but when you have a posse, when you have someone to whom you can unburden the woes of being the single or the one of two physics majors, it helps a lot. Plus, I think the physics field in general, the American Society of Physics, AIP, and the physics societies work really hard to encourage women to go into physics. I think it's less of an ordeal now, certainly than it was when I was a student back in the 50s and 60s. There you were really, really strange and unusual. Now I think there's encouragement, and you should seek it out. You should not feel afraid to do that or embarrassed to do that. In fact, one of the programs I started at the National Science Foundation was the Advance program, which it has a different name now, I think, but this was funds to enable women to study science, to have access to fellowships and creative work in the fields of science. And it now allows groups of women who have funds from the Advanced program to have regular dinners and social events, as well as scientific events where they can get together and not feel ostracized or unusual, but to be with other women from other departments on the campus. And I find I've gone to visit USC, for example, and I was delighted that the engineers and the physicists and the chemists and the biologists and the women faculty got together for lunch and for scientific discussions and so forth. And that's I think, how you get around the problem of being the one and only.
Mm. An anonymous attendee asks, what prompted you to write this book at this point in your life? What was your experience writing it as opposed to scientific texts?
I had reached an age and stage in my career where I could say what I thought without any recourse or any embarrassment. So that's exactly what I did. Obviously, I wasn't rude. I didn't want to be rude, but I did state the case. And what was really enriching about this experience in working with my co-author, who was an amazing person who could find all kinds of fascinating information, was how many women, even famous women who were tremendous scientists, Jocelyn Bell, for example, had gone through all this, women who should have gotten the Nobel Prize but didn't. Their professor got it instead. Of course, in one case, she won a much more prestigious, much more, I think it was a $3 million prize eventually. So there was a reward finally in the end. But I think it was to share the experience and to show that it can be done, and probably also for my daughters, whom I adore. They're wonderful. It turned out great. I have 3 grandchildren now. And as I said, my granddaughter plans to be a neuroscientist. So she's heading off to Smith College in the fall.
You touched on this topic, but we still have some questions related to it. So I thought I'd revisit it. How do we deal with coworkers asking women to do the administrative tasks in a group? Scheduling meetings, sending emails, or generally being asked to do secretary work?
Well, I love Alice Wang's comment. She's married to David Baltimore. She's a very good scientist, excellent scientist in her own right. And she says, and I quote her in the book, it's time for guys to make the coffee and to hand out the coffee. And it's time for the guys to take the notes and to be the secretary for the meetings, and not just because you're the woman to be automatically designated the secretary. And I think Carol Nacy, another wonderful person who has started 2 or 3 companies, a brilliant woman. She has told the story, and it's in the book, about going to a meeting with entrepreneurs to request funding for a new company. And when she shows up, one of the guys will say, hey, would you get me a cup of coffee? And she says, sure. And she loves the look on his face when she is then called to present the defense of the request for funding for this new entrepreneurial company that she herself has devised. So I guess you can get your just rewards in different ways and be rewarded, I guess, by being recognized for your brains eventually.
I had a question actually for you, which is, were there any kind of texts or films that gave you inspiration on this subject, or perhaps just, you know, biographies of women before you, but some sort of inspiration that you found along your career?
I think I was mostly interested in science. I did read, obviously, the stories of the Curies, Madame Curie and her husband Pierre, and I quote in the book that when asked if there were any women scientists, this was in the introduction to the book, and Margaret Walsh Rossiter writes on women scientists, and she's told when she asks if there are any women scientists, no, none, never. What about Madame Curie? She just mixed the pitch blende for her husband's experiments, which was, I think, an extraordinary put down for a woman who wins a couple of Nobel Prizes, not just one. But that is, of course, the era of the time, you know, the thinking of a period of time. It's not totally gone. There are still some, I guess, hibernated men who might think the same, but I don't think too many still exist.
Yeah. We have a question from Maya who says, I'm a mom of 2 on my 2nd year studying chemistry. And she asks, what advice would you give women to break rules in science, or along that aspect?
Well, first of all, here she is studying chemistry with 2 children. That's a monumental task. And, you know, I'd like to see some men do that. Very, very, very few probably do, but not normally. I think probably the one factor that was most important for me was an entirely supportive husband. Jack and I went through grad school together. We went through postdocs together. We raised our children together. And I really mean that. When Allison, my first daughter, was, I think, 3 months old, I was invited to give a lecture, and I would be away for a week. And Jack said, go. He said, I'll take care of her. And he did. He took care of Allison. We did have a babysitter who came in during the day. But I think having strong moral support and also having good childcare makes a huge, huge difference, because then if you are sure that your children are safe, you can then think about all kinds of other abstract and important research topics. But if you're worried about whether your child is going to be safe and you get home that night, then it's hard to be a graduate student.
Yeah. Well, that is all the questions that we have this evening. Thank you so much for all of your wisdom and inspiration tonight. I didn't know if you had any closing words before I end our discussion.
Well, I just think it's been a genuine pleasure. And I do thank all of you out there who were kind enough to be on tonight. I hope that I've been able to share a bit of wisdom and a bit of advice. Science is a wonderful, wonderful career, and I thoroughly recommend it. Engineering too, science, engineering, technology, mathematics, great fields for women. Go for it.
Well, thank you once again, Dr. Colwell, for your time in this lovely event. And thank you to everyone out there for spending your evening with us. Please feel free to learn more about the book and purchase a lab of one's own on harvard.com. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, all here in Cambridge, Mass. Have a good night, keep reading, and please be well. Take care.
Thank you.